In my family, everyone believes sons are born to lead and daughters exist only to assist. I was the only one who knew that was a complete lie. My brother once stood in the boardroom, laughing as he told me I lacked the range for real business. 5 days later, the $85 million he thought was his vanished with a single click of my mouse. My name is Taylor Gonzalez, and in that room, I was nothing more than furniture. I sat at the very end of the long, polished mahogany table, a spot that had been unofficially designated as mine for the last 3 years. To the board members of Oristone Logistics Group, I was the dutiful daughter, the quiet sister, the glorified assistant who took impeccable minutes and ensured the coffee was never lukewarm. They saw a woman who knew how to organize a schedule but not a balance sheet. They were wrong, of course, but I had spent a lifetime curating that specific brand of invisibility. It was my armor. The air in the boardroom was recycled and cold, kept at a temperature that my father, Victor Gonzalez, insisted kept people alert, but really just made everyone uncomfortable. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the skyline of Harbor Crest was gray and imposing, the steel cranes of the shipping docks looking like skeletal fingers against the overcast sky. Inside, the only warmth came from the projector beam cutting through the dim light, illuminating a map of Costa Aurelia on the far wall. My brother, Damien, stood in front of that map like a general explaining a victory he had not yet won. He was wearing a navy suit that likely cost more than the annual salary of our warehouse shift managers, and he moved with the frantic, unearned confidence of a man who has never been told no. He tapped the screen with a laser pointer. "We are looking at a total capital injection of $85 million, he said, his voice booming. "This is not just an expansion. Gentlemen, this is the future of Oristone. With the new distribution hub in Costa Aurelia, we cut our trans-Pacific shipping times by 18%. We dominate the region." He paused for effect, looking around the table to collect his applause. The board members, mostly men my father's age who had held their seats since the 90s, nodded in synchronized approval. They did not see the gaping holes in the proposal. They only saw Victor Gonzalez's son, the heir apparent, the golden boy who could do no wrong. Victor sat at the head of the table, his arms crossed over his chest, a smile stretching across his face that was so proud it looked painful. "Brilliant," Victor said, his voice gravelly and loud. He looked at the other directors. "I told you, the boy has vision. This is the kind of aggressive growth we have been missing. This is what leadership looks like." I looked down at my notepad. My pen hovered over the lines, but I was not writing down his platitudes. I was writing down the numbers he was glossing over. I knew this deal better than he did. I knew it because I had read the diligence reports he had skimmed. I knew it because, unbeknownst to him or anyone else in this room, I was the one holding the leash on the funding he was so arrogantly promising. Damien continued, flipping to a slide filled with projected revenue charts that pointed aggressively upward. "The funding is secured. We have a consortium of international investors who are eager to back a legacy brand like ours. They see the value. They trust the management." That word, trust, it echoed in my head, sharp and ironic. I cleared my throat. It was a soft sound, but in the reverent silence of the boardroom, it sounded like a gunshot. Damien stopped mid-sentence. He turned his head slowly toward me, his expression shifting from triumph to annoyance. It was the look one gives a buzzing fly. I kept my voice even, stripping it of any emotion. "Damien," I said, looking at the screen rather than him, "I am looking at the term sheet regarding the capital structure. You mentioned the funding is secured, but the fine print suggests the $85 million is tranched based on operational milestones." I paused, letting the silence settle for a second before continuing. "More importantly, there is a clause regarding the lead investor's right to withdraw. If the initial capital call is not met by 90% within 5 business days of the signing, the entire deal collapses, and we are liable for the break fee. What specific guarantees do we have that the lead investor is locked in? Because if they pull out, Oristone is on the hook for $15 million in penalties." The room went dead silent. The board members shifted in their leather chairs, the leather creaking awkwardly. It was a reasonable question. It was, in fact, the only question that mattered. Any competent executive would have an answer prepared. But Damien did not have an answer. He had an ego. He chuckled, a dry, condescending sound that bounced off the glass walls. He walked over to the table, placing his hands on the back of the chair opposite me, leaning in as if explaining algebra to a toddler. "Taylor," he said, shaking his head with a pitying smile, "always looking for the shadows, aren't you? This is why you are great at taking notes. Sweetie, you focus on the typos while the rest of us are writing the novel." He looked back at our father, seeking validation. Victor grunted, waving a hand dismissively in my direction. "Taylor, do not nitpick. The investors are solid. Damien has vetted them." I tightened my grip on my pen until my knuckles turned white. "I am not nitpicking. Dad," I said, keeping my tone respectful but firm, "I am asking about risk management. If that $85 million vanishes, we do not just lose the expansion, we lose liquidity." Damien slammed his hand down on the table. It was not a hard slam, just enough to make the water glasses tremble. "Stop," he snapped. His veneer of corporate professionalism cracked, revealing the petulant child underneath. "You do not understand how these deals work. Taylor, you have never sat across from a shark. You have never closed a deal. You have never touched real business in your life." The phrase hung in the air. Real business. I looked at him. I looked at the man who had needed me to rewrite his college admission essays, the man who had needed me to fix the payroll errors he caused last quarter, the man who was currently bragging about spending money that, technically, belonged to me. He thinks real business is a PowerPoint presentation and a steak dinner. I thought, he has no idea that real business is what happens when the dinner is over and the check comes. Lydia Moore, our CFO, cleared her throat. She was a sharp woman, one of the few people in the company I respected, but she had been beaten down by years of Victor's bullying. She adjusted her glasses, looking nervous. "Actually, Victor," Lydia said, her voice small, "Taylor has a point about the break fee. The exposure is significant if the lead investor walks. Perhaps we should review the—" "Lydia!" Victor barked, cutting her off without even looking at her. "You are the CFO. Your job is to find the money, not the problems. If Damien says the money is there, the money is there. Do not let Taylor's anxiety infect you. She is just risk-averse. It is a female trait." My stomach churned. It was not just the sexism. It was the casual, accepted nature of it. It was the way the other men at the table nodded, as if my father had just stated a biological fact rather than a gross insult. Damien smirked at me. "See? Even Dad thinks you are overreacting. Look, Taylor, just stick to the agenda, okay? Make sure the lunch order is correct for the partners coming in at noon. Leave the strategy to the people who are actually in the arena." I stared at him. For a moment, I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up, open my laptop, and show them the dashboard of Falcon Ridge Capital. I wanted to show them that the consortium Damien was so proud of was 3 shell companies that all led back to a single trust in my name. I wanted to tell him that the shark he thought he was negotiating with was his little sister, sitting 10 feet away. But I did not. The rage was there, burning hot in my chest. But I swallowed it. I forced it down into the pit of my stomach where I kept everything else. Emotional outbursts were for people who had no power. I had all the power. They just did not know it yet. I looked down at my notebook. I wrote down his exact words. "You have never touched real business." I wrote down the time. 10:45 in the morning. I wrote down my father's comment about female anxiety. I was building a transcript. I was building a case. "I will not complicate the issue," I said softly. "Good," Damien said, turning his back on me to face the screen again. "Now, moving on to the operational timeline, we expect to break ground in Costa Aurelia by the 1st of next month." He droned on, his voice full of self-importance. I watched him for another minute, studying the way he moved, the way he preened. He was a peacock strutting on a rug that I was about to pull out from under him. My phone, sitting face down on the table, did not ring. It did not vibrate, but I reached out and picked it up anyway, tapping the screen to illuminate it. I furrowed my brow, feigning concern. I stood up. The scraping of my chair against the floor interrupted Damien's flow for the second time. "Where are you going?" Victor asked, annoyed. "I apologize," I said, clutching the phone to my chest. "I have an urgent call. It is personal. I have to take this." Damien rolled his eyes, throwing his hands up in a theatrical display of frustration. "Of course, we are discussing an $85 million acquisition, and she has to take a personal call. Go ahead. Taylor, go handle your little drama." He looked at the board members and winked. Some people just cannot handle the pace of a discussion this large. I did not look back. I did not defend myself. I walked to the heavy oak doors, my heels clicking rhythmically against the floor. I could feel their eyes on my back. Dismissive, patronizing, amused. They thought I was fleeing the room because I was embarrassed. They thought I was running away to cry in the bathroom or gossip with a friend. I opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, letting the heavy wood click shut behind me, sealing the noise of their arrogance inside. The corridor was silent. I took a deep breath, the cold air of the office filling my lungs. My face was calm. My hands were steady. I was not running away. I was stepping out to make the call that would end them. Damien was right about one thing. He was playing with real money now. He just forgot the first rule of real business. Never take money from someone you have spent your whole life disrespecting. I walked toward the elevators, not to leave the building, but to go to the quiet, soundproof phone booth on the far side of the floor. I held my phone in my hand, my thumb hovering over the contact list. I found the name I needed. Noah Reyes, Falcon Ridge Capital. It was time to teach my brother a lesson that $85 million could not buy. It was time to show him exactly what I could handle. The small conference room was only 40 feet away from the main boardroom, but it felt like a different universe. I stepped inside and turned the lock on the heavy handle. The click was mechanical and final, a sound that severed the tether between Taylor, the submissive sister, and the woman I actually was. The room was soundproof, designed for sensitive negotiations. It was sterile, smelling faintly of lemon cleaner and dry erase markers. I walked to the window, looking out at the sprawling container yard of Harbor Crest below. From this height, the massive shipping containers looked like Lego bricks, colorful and insignificant. My father and brother treated this company like a kingdom, but to the market, it was just another asset class, just another ticker symbol. I pulled my phone out and dialed the number that was saved under a fake name in my contact list. It rang once. Noah Reyes picked up immediately. "Ms. Gonzalez," he said. His voice was crisp, lacking the obsequious tone my father's subordinates used. Noah spoke to me with the reverence of a soldier addressing a general, or perhaps a banker addressing a whale. "I need a status report on the Oristone expansion vehicle," I said, skipping the pleasantries. My voice was steady, stripping away the slight tremble that had threatened to surface in the hallway. "One moment," Noah replied. I could hear the rapid clacking of a mechanical keyboard on his end. I envisioned him in his office at Falcon Ridge Capital, surrounded by 3 monitors, tracking the pulse of money moving across oceans. "Here we are," Noah said. "The total capital requirement for the Costa Aurelia expansion is $85 million. As of this morning, the commitment from the primary consortium is fully subscribed." "Break it down for me, Noah," I said, leaning my forehead against the cool glass of the window. "Remind me who exactly makes up this consortium." There was a pause, though he did not need to check the files. He knew the structure as well as I did. "The lead investor is Nebula Holdings, contributing $40 million, he recited. "The secondary tranche comes from Apex Ventures and Blue Horizon Trust, contributing $19 million each. The remaining $7 million is scattered among smaller high-risk equity firms." "And who owns Nebula, Apex, and Blue Horizon?" I asked, though I knew the answer. I needed to hear it aloud. I needed to solidify the reality of what I was about to do. You do, Ms. Gonzalez, Noah said. Through a series of blind trusts and offshore holding companies registered in the Cayman Islands and Singapore, you are the beneficial owner of $78 million of the committed capital. You are the consortium. I closed my eyes. $78 million. It was a staggering amount of money to most people, an abstraction to my brother. But to me, it was leverage. Damien believed he had charmed a group of faceless international financiers. He thought his charisma and his PowerPoint slides had unlocked the vault. He had no idea that the money had come from the sister he had just publicly humiliated for not understanding real business. He did not know that for the last 7 years, while he was partying on yachts in the Mediterranean and networking at country clubs, I had been trading. I had been building. What is the current valuation of my total portfolio? I asked. The keyboard clacked again. Market close yesterday was strong, Noah said. With the recent rally in tech and the liquidity event from the biopharmaceutical merger last week, your total assets under management across all entities currently sit at $920 million. $920 million. The number hung in the air between us. I was dangerously close to being a billionaire, a milestone I would likely hit before my 32nd birthday. My father, for all his bluster and posturing, was worth perhaps $60 million on a good day, and most of that was illiquid, tied up in the trucks and warehouses of Auristone. I possessed nearly 15 times the wealth of the man who still told me not to speak in meetings. The irony was acidic. It burned the back of my throat. I had spent years playing the role of the quiet, diligent daughter. I had dimmed my light so Damien would not be blinded. I had made myself smaller to fit into the box they built for me, terrified that if I showed my true capacity, I would shatter the fragile ego of the men in my family. I had chosen peace over recognition. But peace was no longer an option. Not after today. Let's talk about the kill switch, I said. Noah's tone shifted instantly. He became sharper, more cautious. You are referring to the withdrawal clause in the Series A agreement? Yes, I said. If the lead investor pulls out, what happens to the project? It collapses immediately. Noah said, the terms are explicit. The Costa Aurelia government requires proof of 90% funding liquidity before they issue the construction permits. If Nebula Holdings withdraws its $40 million, the other tranches are contractually invalidated. The deal structure is a house of cards. Taylor, you pull the bottom card, and gravity does the rest. And the penalties? I asked. Auristone Logistics would be in breach of the preliminary contract. Noah explained. They would be liable for the break fee to the local partners and the underwriting banks. I estimate the immediate cash liability would be between $15 and $20 million. I flinched. 15 to 20 million. That was not just a slap on the wrist. That was a hemorrhage. That was enough to wipe out Auristone's operating profit for the last 2 years. It would not bankrupt the company, but it would cripple it. It would force layoffs. It would freeze salaries. It would destroy my father's reputation. I looked down at the street again. I watched a truck with the Auristone logo, a blue stone with a gold wing, turn the corner. My grandfather had designed that logo. Flashbacks hit me without warning. I was 13 years old, sitting at the formica table in my grandmother's kitchen. The air smelled of rosemary and old paper. Grandma Lucia was not the type of woman who baked cookies or knitted sweaters. She was the woman who managed the family's books before my father took over and decided women were too emotional for finance. Look at the numbers. Taylor. She had told me, her arthritic finger tracing a line on a ledger. Men will lie to you. They will lie to themselves. They will tell you they are kings when they are beggars. But the numbers never lie. If you can read this, you can read their souls. She had taught me to see the story behind the digits. She taught me that cash flow was the bloodstream and debt was the gravity. By the time I was 18, I was reading annual reports for fun. By 22, I had taken a small inheritance she left me and leveraged it into my first million using options trading that Damien would have called gambling, but I called calculated probability. I had tried to show them, Once, I remembered walking into my father's office at 24, fresh out of business school, holding a proposal to modernize our inventory tracking. I had found a way to save the company $3 million a year. My father had not even looked up from his newspaper. "Give it to Damien," he had said. "He needs the practice." Damien had taken my idea, butchered the implementation, and cost the company $500,000. And yet, he was still the genius. I was still the assistant. "Ms. Gonzalez?" Noah's voice pulled me back to the present. "I am here," I said. Noah hesitated. "I have to advise you as your portfolio manager. If you execute this withdrawal, you are not just burning a bridge, you are nuking the site. The market will see Oristone as toxic. No serious institutional investor will touch them for at least 5 years. The stock price of the parent entity could drop by 30% overnight." "I know," I said. "If this were any other company," Noah continued, his voice lowering, "and you saw a board of directors acting this recklessly, ignoring risk, silencing dissent, putting an incompetent figurehead in charge of an $85 million expansion, what would you do?" I stared at my reflection in the glass. I saw a woman in a beige pencil skirt and a sensible blouse. I saw the disguise I had worn for so long that it had started to feel like my skin. But underneath, there was the investor, the shark, the woman who had turned 5 figures into 9. "If it were any other company," I whispered, "I would short the stock and pull my capital before the ink was dry." "Exactly," Noah said. "So why is this different?" I asked myself. Because they share my last name? Because we share DNA? My brother had stood in that boardroom 10 minutes ago and told the world I was incompetent. He had risked the livelihoods of 4,000 employees on a vanity project because he refused to listen to the one person who actually checked the math. If I let this funding go through, I am not being a good sister. I realized I am being an enabler. I am financing his delusion. I am paying $85 million to let him pretend he is a businessman. I took a deep breath. The air in the room seemed to vibrate. "Prepare the withdrawal notice," I said. My voice was cold, unfamiliar even to my own ears. "Are you sure?" Noah asked. "Execute it," I said. "Issue the formal notice of withdrawal from Nebula, Apex, and Blue Horizon. Cite material adverse change in the risk profile and lack of confidence in the executive management team. Make it clean. Make it legal. And Noah?" "Yes, Ms. Gonzalez?" "Time it for Sunday night," I said. "Let them have their weekend. I want the notification to hit the servers at 7 in the evening, right when they are sitting down for dinner." "Understood," Noah said. The click of his keyboard was the sound of a guillotine blade being hoisted up, waiting to drop. I hung up the phone. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the black screen of my device. My heart was pounding, a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I felt a wave of nausea, followed immediately by a rush of adrenaline so potent it made my hands shake. I was about to cause $15 million in damages to my own family. I was about to humiliate my father and destroy my brother's career. But as I unlocked the door and prepared to step back out into the hallway, I realized something else. They had brought this on themselves. They had asked for real business. They had demanded a world where emotions did not matter, where only results counted. I was just giving them exactly what they asked for. If a stranger would not trust Damien Gonzalez with $85 million, then why should I be the fool who did? I opened the door and walked back toward the elevators. I did not return to the boardroom. I had seen enough. The next time I saw my brother, he would not be standing in front of a map of Costa Aurelia, bragging about the future. He would be looking at the ruins of his present, wondering where the money went. And I would be the only one who knew the answer. I remained standing by the window of the small conference room, looking down at the industrial majesty of Harborcrest. From up here, the Oristone Empire looked invincible. I watched the gantry cranes hoist 40-foot steel containers into the air as if they were shoeboxes, swinging them onto the decks of waiting cargo ships. Each container represented a promise kept, a contract fulfilled, a small pulse in the global economy. This was the legacy my grandfather had built with sweat and a single second-hand truck. It was the legacy my father had expanded with brute force. And it was the legacy my brother was about to drive off a cliff because he was too arrogant to read a risk assessment. The sight of the harbor pulled a memory from the deep recesses of my mind, sharp and stinging. I was 17 years old. We were sitting at the dinner table in the family estate. A cavernous room where the silence was often louder than the conversation. I had spent 3 weeks researching automated guided vehicles for warehouse management, a technology that was just starting to emerge. I had typed up a 20-page report, bound it in a clear plastic folder, and placed it nervously next to my father's wine glass. "Dad," I had said, my voice trembling slightly, "I think we can reduce sorting errors by 30% if we pilot this system in the West Wing." My father had picked up the report, flipped through it for perhaps 10 seconds, and then tossed it back onto the table. It landed with a soft slap near the butter dish. "Robots? Taylor?" he had asked, not looking at me but at the steak on his fork. "We run a logistics company, not a science fiction convention." Damien, who was 22 at the time and fresh out of a university program he had barely passed, laughed. It was that same dry, hollow laugh he had used in the boardroom today. "She has been watching too many movies, Dad," Damien had said, reaching for a bread roll. "Leave the thinking to the men. Tay, you just worry about passing algebra." I had burned with shame, shrinking into my chair, but the crushing blow came a moment later when my father raised his glass to toast Damien's graduation. To Damien. Victor had announced, his eyes shining with adoration. The only brain in this family. The future CEO. The only brain. I had carried those 3 words around like a stone in my pocket for over a decade. I had let them define me. I had let them convince me that my role was to be the silent mechanic in the engine room while they stood on the bridge wearing the captain's hat. I had allowed them to maintain the illusion that Damien was a genius because it was easier than challenging the patriarchy that held our family together. But standing by the window, watching the gray water of the harbor churn, I realized that my silence had stopped being a survival tactic. It had become complicity. By hiding my competence, I had allowed Damien's incompetence to metastasize. I had let him believe he was untouchable, and now, that belief was going to cost us $85 million. I pulled up the risk assessment memo on my tablet, the one Damien had dismissed as nitpicking. I scrolled through the pages, my eyes scanning the red flags he had ignored. Item 4. Currency volatility in Costa Aurelia regarding the pegged exchange rate. Item 7. Pending labor strikes in the construction sector of the target region. Item 12. The unverified liquidity of the local subcontractors. Any one of these issues could derail a project. Combined, they were a death sentence. Damien had not just ignored them. He had actively suppressed them because they did not fit the narrative of his glorious conquest. He was buying a mansion built on a sinkhole because he liked the view. I tapped my earpiece, reconnecting the line to Noah Reyes. He was still there, waiting silently. "Noah," I said, my voice low, "read me the clause regarding the timeline of the withdrawal again. I need to hear the exact mechanism." I heard the rustle of paper on his end. Clause 17, Section B. Noah recited, "The lead investor reserves the right to rescind capital commitment prior to the final closing date if there is a material breach of confidence in the operational leadership or if the risk profile of the project exceeds the initial threshold defined in Schedule A." "And the notification requirement?" I asked. "Immediate electronic delivery to the CFO and the General Counsel." Noah said, "Once the server acknowledges receipt, the contract is null and void. The capital lock is released, and the funds return to the origin accounts within 2 hours." 2 hours. That was how long it would take to drain the lifeblood from Damien's dream. I leaned back against the wall, closing my eyes. A wave of guilt washed over me, heavy and suffocating. It was not guilt for Damien or my father. It was guilt for the innocent bystanders. If I pulled this funding, the stock price would take a hit. The warehouse workers, the drivers, the administrative staff. They all relied on the stability of this company. Was I letting my personal vendetta endanger their livelihoods? I wrestled with the thought, if I stayed silent, the deal would go through. The $85 million, my money, would be spent, and in 6 months or a year, when the currency in Costa Aurelia crashed or the labor strikes halted construction, the money would be gone, the project would fail then, and the loss would be total. The company would bleed out slowly, painfully. Stopping it now was violent. Yes, it was a shock to the system, but it was a controlled demolition rather than a catastrophic collapse. I was saving the patient by amputating the gangrenous limb, even if the patient screamed during the surgery. I thought of my grandmother, Lucia. I remembered the texture of her hands, rough and warm. I remembered the day she caught me doing Damien's homework for him, because he had threatened to tell Dad I broke a vase. She had grabbed my chin, forcing me to look her in the eye. "Taylor," she had said, her voice fierce, "kindness is a virtue, but kindness does not mean covering for the stupidity of the spoiled. If you shield a man from his own failures, you do not help him. You only ensure that when he finally falls, he falls from a height that will kill him." She was right. I had been shielding Damien for his entire life. I had fixed his spreadsheets. I had smoothed over his HR complaints. I had quietly injected capital into his smaller failing projects through anonymous channels just to keep the family peace. I had built the pedestal he stood on. It was time to kick it over. I took a deep breath. Inhaling the sterile air of the conference room, I felt a shift happen inside me. The sister who sought approval evaporated. The daughter who feared her father's voice dissolved. In their place stood the managing partner of Falcon Ridge Capital. In their place stood the woman who had turned a small inheritance into an empire that dwarfed the very company she was standing in. I was not here to be a good sister. I was here to be a responsible investor. And a responsible investor does not give $85 million to a man who thinks due diligence is a waste of time. I opened my eyes. The doubt was gone. "Noah," I said, "proceed as discussed. Set the timer for Sunday night. I want the email to land between the appetizer and the main course." "Understood," Noah replied. I ended the call and slipped the phone into my pocket. I walked over to the small mirror hanging on the back of the door. I looked at myself. My expression was different. The softness around my eyes had hardened. My posture was straighter. I smoothed down my skirt and adjusted the collar of my blouse. I unlocked the door and stepped back into the hallway. The hum of the office seemed distant, irrelevant. I walked back toward the main boardroom, my heels striking the floor with a deliberate, rhythmic cadence. When I reached the heavy oak doors, I did not hesitate. I did not knock. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The atmosphere in the room had not changed. Damien was still standing at the head of the table, his jacket unbuttoned, laughing at something one of the directors had said. The air still smelled of stale coffee and male ego. They all turned to look at me as I entered. Damien's smile faltered slightly, then returned, dripping with condescension. "Back so soon?" he asked. "I hope your personal crisis is resolved." We were just discussing the groundbreaking ceremony. I was thinking of inviting the governor. I walked to my seat at the end of the table. I did not sit down immediately. I stood behind my chair, placing my hands on the cool leather backrest. I looked at Damien, really looked at him. I saw the insecurity masked by arrogance. I saw the fear behind the bluster. "It is resolved," I said. My voice was calm, devoid of any apology. "Good," Victor grunted. "Sit down. Taylor, you are distracting the board." I pulled my chair out slowly and sat. I picked up my pen. I did not look at my father. I fixed my gaze on Damien, my eyes locking onto his. "Please, continue." "Damien," I said, "tell us more about the future." Damien blinked, unsettled by the flatness of my tone. He cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. "Right. Well, as I was saying..." He turned back to the screen, launching into a description of the architectural rendering, but the energy in the room had shifted. A cold draft seemed to have followed me in from the hallway. I watched him point at the imaginary building on the screen, a building that would never be built. I watched him spend money that was already gone. Enjoy it, brother. I thought, enjoy these last 48 hours of being the genius, because when Monday morning comes, you are going to learn the difference between inheritance and aptitude. I opened my notebook and wrote down one final entry for the day's minutes. Time, 11:15 in the morning. The board continues to discuss the allocation of unsecured funds. The countdown has begun. I closed the notebook. The sound was soft, final, like the closing of a coffin lid. I sat back and waited for the Sunday that would change everything. Saturday noon was a masterclass in collective delusion. I sat in the sunroom of my parents' house, watching my mother, Elena, smooth out the pages of the Harborcrest Business Journal on the glass coffee table. She treated the newspaper like a holy text, her manicured fingers tracing the headline with a reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. The new era of logistics. Damian Gonzalez leads Oristone into the future. Look at this picture. Taylor, my mother said, beaming. She tapped the photo of Damian standing in front of a construction site, wearing a hard hat that had clearly never seen a speck of dust. He looks so commanding. Your father says this deal is going to put us in the same league as the national carriers. I took a sip of my iced tea, the condensation cold against my palm. It is a great photo. Mom, I said. My voice was flat. But she did not notice. She never noticed. She was too busy living in the reflected glow of the men in her life. He is going to be a titan, she sighed, leaning back, just like your father. I said nothing. I looked at the date on the top of the page. Saturday. The clock was ticking. In roughly 30 hours, the Titan would be kneeling in the rubble of his own ego. By Sunday night, the atmosphere had shifted from celebratory to ceremonial. We gathered at my father's estate for our weekly family dinner. The dining room was cavernous, lit by a crystal chandelier that cast a fractured, golden light over the table. The air smelled of rosemary and expensive red wine. This was the stage where the Gonzalez family performed their weekly play of unity and success. Victor sat at the head of the table, carving a roast with surgical precision. Damien sat to his right, already 3 glasses of Cabernet deep, flushed with the intoxication of imminent victory. I sat across from him, sipping water. Tomorrow is the big day. Dad, Damien announced, gesturing with his fork. The wire transfer hits the Costa Aurelia accounts at 9 in the morning local time. By noon, we will have the excavators rolling. I have already drafted the press release for the groundbreaking. Excellent, Victor rumbled, placing a slice of meat on Damien's plate. You have done well, son. This is what I always knew you were capable of. Taking the initiative. Securing the capital. That is leadership. I cut a small piece of potato and put it in my mouth. It tasted like ash. They were celebrating a victory that had already been rescinded. They just did not know it yet. Then, the vibration started. Damien's phone, sitting face up on the tablecloth next to his wine glass, buzzed. It was a harsh, aggressive sound against the mahogany. He glanced at the screen and waved a hand dismissively. Who is it? My mother asked. Just the legal team in Costa Aurelia, Damien said, taking a bite of steak. Probably just confirming the bank details again. They are nervous. Little people always get nervous when this much money is moving around. He ignored the call. The buzzing stopped. 2 minutes later, it started again. Buzz, buzz, buzz. Damien sighed, rolling his eyes. Persistent, aren't they? It is Sunday night. Do they not have lives? He rejected the call. Victor chuckled. They want to be close to the power. Damien, let them wait. It teaches them respect. I watched the phone. I knew exactly who was calling. It was likely the frantic local partner, or perhaps the head of the bank's compliance department, staring at a notification that the funding guarantee had just evaporated. The phone buzzed a 3rd time, then a 4th. Damien, my mother said, frowning slightly. Maybe you should answer. It seems urgent. It is fine, Mom, Damien snapped, his patience fraying. I told you. It is just administrative nonsense. I will deal with it in the morning. The fifth call came immediately after the fourth. This time, it was not just a buzz, it was a demand. Fine. Damien groaned. He snatched the phone off the table and stabbed the answer button. He held it to his ear, his expression one of exaggerated annoyance. "What?" he barked into the receiver. "I am having dinner with my family. This had better be—" He stopped. The room went silent. I watched the blood drain from my brother's face. It happened in slow motion, like a curtain being dropped. The flush of wine and arrogance vanished, replaced by a sickly pale gray. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He listened for 10 seconds. His hand began to shake. "What do you mean?" he whispered. His voice was unrecognizable. It was high, thin, and terrified. "That is impossible. We have a signed contract. The money is locked." He listened again. He stood up slowly, knocking his chair back. It scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, a harsh screech that made my mother jump. "Breach?" Damien shouted. The sudden volume made us all flinch. "What breach?" "No, you cannot withdraw. That is $85 million. You cannot just—" He stopped again, listening to the person on the other end cutting him off. I could hear the faint, tinny sound of screaming coming from the earpiece. My pocket buzzed, a single short vibration. I slipped my hand under the table and checked my phone. A text message from Noah Reyes. "Withdrawal executed. Clean. Confirmation numbers sent to all parties." I locked my phone and placed it face down on the table. The sound of the glass screen hitting the wood was soft, but in the silence of the room, it felt heavy. Damien lowered his phone. He looked like he had been punched in the gut. He stared at the device in his hand as if it were a venomous snake that had just bitten him. "Damien?" Victor asked, his knife hovering over the roast. "What is going on?" Damien looked up. His eyes were wide, wild with panic. "The money," he stammered. "The money is gone." Victor frowned. "What do you mean, gone?" "Pulled," Damien said, his voice trembling. "The consortium, Nebula Holdings, they just sent a formal notice of withdrawal. They are invoking the risk clause. They are pulling the entire $85 million. Victor dropped his knife. It clattered onto the china plate. "That is ridiculous," Victor said, his face reddening. "Call them back. Tell them we will sue. We have a binding agreement." "They say we are in breach," Damien said, running a hand through his hair. He looked like he was about to vomit. "They say the risk profile changed. They say they have lost confidence in the management. Dad, the partners in Costa Aurelia are screaming. They are saying if the funds do not hit by morning, they are filing for damages. $15 million in penalties." Damien looked around the room, his eyes darting frantically. "Who are these people? I met the brokers. They were solid. Who is Nebula Holdings? Why would they do this?" I picked up my napkin and dabbed the corner of my mouth. I folded it neatly and placed it next to my plate. "They did it because the lead investor realized you did not read the risk assessment," I said. The voice was mine, but it sounded like a stranger's. It was calm, detached, and utterly cold. Damien whipped his head toward me. "What did you say?" I stood up. I smoothed the front of my dress. "Nebula Holdings," I said clearly. "It is not a they. Damien, it is a me." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Victor stared at me, his eyes narrowing in confusion, trying to process the words. Damien blinked, shaking his head. "What? You? What are you talking about? You are an assistant. You do not have money." I walked around the table until I was standing directly opposite my father. "Nebula Holdings is a shell company registered in Singapore," I said, reciting the details with the precision of a surgeon. "It is wholly owned by Falcon Ridge Capital, and Falcon Ridge Capital is my private equity fund." I turned to Damien. "I provided the $40 million lead tranche that secured your consortium," I said. "I was the one who approved the initial term sheet, and I was the one who just ordered the withdrawal because I refused to let you bankrupt this family with a project you are too incompetent to manage." Damien's face contorted. Confusion gave way to a sudden, blinding rage. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "You?" he screamed. "You sabotaged me? You are the investor? That is a lie. You do not have $85 million. You make $60,000 a year." I looked at him with pity. "I made $60,000 a year from Aurastone." I corrected him. "My portfolio broke $900 million last week." I looked at my father. For the first time in my life, I did not see the dismissive tyrant. I saw a man who was suddenly unsure of the ground he was standing on. He looked from Damien, sweating and screaming, to me, standing calm and composed. Victor's mouth opened, but no words came out. The certainty that had defined his entire existence, the belief that his son was the king and his daughter was the servant, was cracking right in front of his eyes. "Taylor," Victor whispered, "is this true?" I nodded once. "It is true, Dad," I said, "and unless Damien resigns from the project tonight, the withdrawal stands. The penalties will hit tomorrow." I looked back at my brother. "Welcome to real business, Damien." "Elena, leave us." My father's voice was low, vibrating with a tone that brooked no argument. It was not a request. It was an order. My mother looked between the three of us. Damien, pale and sweating, Victor, red-faced and confused, and me, standing perfectly still. She clutched her napkin to her chest, her eyes wide with fear. But she did not ask questions. She had spent 40 years not asking questions. She stood up, the chair scraping softly against the rug, and hurried out of the dining room, closing the double doors behind her. The latch clicked. The sound was like a judge's gavel hitting the sound block. We were alone. The silence lasted for perhaps 5 seconds before Damien shattered it. He lunged toward me, bracing his hands on the table, his knuckles white. "You did this on purpose," he hissed. Spittle flew from his lips. "You waited. You watched me set this whole thing up. You watched me negotiate with the partners. You watched me draft the press releases. And you waited until the 11th hour to pull the rug out." He pointed a shaking finger at my face. "This is not business. Taylor, this is sickness. You are sick. You are so consumed by jealousy that you would burn down the family legacy just to make me look bad. You want to humiliate me because you cannot stand that Dad chose me to lead." I watched him scream. It was fascinating, in a clinical sort of way. He was not grieving the loss of the money. He was grieving the loss of his narrative. "Are you finished?" I asked. "No, I am not finished," he roared. "You are a liar. You do not have that kind of money. You are playing some kind of shell game. Who is backing you? Is it a competitor? Are you fronting for someone who wants a hostile takeover?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I did not answer him with words. I tapped the screen, connecting to the large 80-inch television mounted above the fireplace, a screen usually reserved for my father to watch market news or golf tournaments. I swiped up, casting a secure document from my encrypted drive. The screen flickered to life. A complex organizational chart appeared, crisp and undeniable against the black background. At the top was Falcon Ridge Capital. Below that, 3 branching lines led to Nebula Holdings, Apex Ventures, and Blue Horizon Trust, and at the very bottom, in the box designated for the ultimate beneficial owner, was a single name, Taylor Marie Gonzalez. Next to my name was a verified bank balance time-stamped from this morning, $921,400,000. Damien stared at the screen, his mouth hung open, the anger drained out of him, replaced by a sheer, dumbfounded comprehension. The numbers were too big to argue with. The legal structure was too clean to fake. I walked over to the sideboard and poured myself a glass of water. "I did not do this to humiliate you. Damien," I said, turning back to face them, "I did this because I read the diligence reports." I tapped my phone again. The screen changed. It was now displaying a chain of emails. "Do you recognize these?" I asked. Damien squinted at the screen. "These are emails sent to your private server 3 weeks ago." I explained. "They are from Noah Reyes, the portfolio manager at Falcon Ridge. The subject line reads, Urgent risk assessment regarding Costa Aurelia currency, PEG and labor instability. I pointed to the timestamp. You opened this email. Damien. You opened it at 10 in the morning on a Tuesday. You spent 14 seconds looking at it before you archived it. You never replied. You never asked for a follow-up. I swiped to the next image. It was a formal letter of concern sent by Nebula Holdings to the Auristone Legal Department. And this one, I continued. This was sent 10 days ago. It explicitly stated that funding was contingent on a secondary audit of the local contractors. You waived the audit. Damien, you signed a waiver claiming personal responsibility for the contractor vetting because you wanted to speed up the timeline for your groundbreaking ceremony. I put my phone down on the table. I did not sabotage you. I said, my voice hard. I gave you warnings. I gave you every opportunity to act like a CEO. A real CEO would have investigated the concerns of his lead investor. A real CEO would have paused to mitigate risk. You ignored the warnings because you thought the money was free. You thought investors were just ATMs that you could charm with a smile and a firm handshake. Damien slumped into his chair. He looked small. The suit that had looked so expensive an hour ago now seemed to hang off him like a costume. Victor finally spoke. He had been staring at the TV screen. His eyes locked on the balance next to my name. He turned his gaze to me. It was a look I had never seen before, a mix of fear and calculation. Taylor, he said, his voice struggling for authority. Turn that off. I tapped the phone, and the screen went black. Victor took a deep breath. He placed his hands on the table, trying to regain control of the room. You have made your point, he said. You have money. You have built something. Impressive, I admit. I did not know. I underestimated you. He paused, waiting for me to thank him for the crumb of validation. I did not. But this? Victor gestured to Damien, who was staring blankly at the tablecloth. This is not how we treat family. We do not ambush each other. We do not let our own blood walk into a trap. If you saw dangers in the project, you should have come to me. You should have come to this house, sat at this table, and told us. You should not have hidden behind shell companies and lawyers. I laughed. It was a short, sharp sound. Come to you? I asked. Like I came to you when I was 17 with the automation report? Like I came to you last year with the logistics software update? Dad, every time I have ever tried to speak to you about business in this house, you have told me to go help Mom in the kitchen. That is different, Victor snapped. This is $85 million. This is the company's reputation. It is not different, I countered. It is exactly the same. You just care now because the check is big enough to hurt. I am your father. Taylor, he shouted, slamming his hand on the table. And Damien is your brother. You have a moral obligation to support this family. You cannot just withdraw funding and leave us exposed to $15 million in penalties. That is betrayal. I walked toward him. I stopped at the edge of the table, looking down at the man who had cast a shadow over my entire life. Let me explain something to you about the world I live in. Dad, I said, in my world, we do not have moral obligations to incompetence. We have fiduciary duties to our capital. I pointed at Damien. I reviewed the project as an investor. I said, the project is toxic. The risk is unmanageable. The leadership is negligent. If I left my money in that deal, I would be violating my own risk parameters. I pulled the capital because it was a bad trade. That is it. That is the only morality that applies here. Damien looked up. His eyes were red. Fix it, he whispered. Excuse me? I asked. Fix it. Taylor, Damien yelled, finding a sudden burst of desperate energy. Call them back. Call Noah. Tell him it was a mistake. Tell him to reverse the wire. Put the money back. I shook my head slowly. No. You have to, Damien cried. If you do not put the money back by morning, the deal dies. The penalties kick in. I will look like an idiot. The board will see the truth. I finished for him. Damien scrambled up from his chair. He ran around the table and grabbed my arm. His grip was tight, desperate. Taylor, Please, he begged, his voice cracked. Do not do this to me. I will give you anything. I will give you a seat on the board. I will give you credit. Just put the money back. Do not let me fail. I looked at his hand on my arm. Then I looked at his face. For a fleeting second, I felt the old instinct, the sisterly urge to wipe his nose, fix his mess, and let him pretend he was strong. It would be so easy to make the call. It would be so easy to buy the peace. But then I remembered the boardroom. I remembered him laughing. You can't handle real business. I pulled my arm away from his grasp. I stepped back, creating a physical distance that matched the emotional chasm between us. I am not going to save you. Damien, I said softly, because if I save you now, you will never learn. You will just find a bigger cliff to drive off next time. I turned to my father. And you, I said, you wanted a shark in the family? You wanted a killer? Well, congratulations. Victor, you got one. You just bet on the wrong child. I picked up my purse from the side chair. I am leaving. I said, do not call me unless it is through my secretary. I have a busy week ahead. Taylor, Victor shouted as I turned my back. You cannot just walk out. We are not done. We are done, I said, not looking back. The money is gone. The lesson is free. Good night. I walked out of the dining room. I walked through the foyer, past the portraits of our ancestors who stared down with stern, judgmental eyes. I opened the heavy front door and stepped out into the cool night air. As I walked down the stone steps toward my car, I could hear them, through the thick walls of the estate. I could hear the muffled sounds of shouting. I heard Damien's high-pitched panic and Victor's booming rage. They were yelling at each other. They were turning on one another. Two drowning men realizing there was no life raft coming. I unlocked my car and slid into the driver's seat. I sat there for a moment in the silence, listening to the engine purr to life. I did not feel happy. I did not feel triumphant. I felt a cold, clean clarity. I put the car in gear and drove away, leaving the lights of the mansion fading in my rearview mirror. Behind me, the house of cards was finally falling down. The emergency board meeting began at 9 o'clock on Monday morning, but the tension in the room suggested we had been there for days. The gray Harbor Crest sky pressed against the glass windows, matching the pallor on the faces of the 12 directors seated around the mahogany table. Just 48 hours ago, this room had been a theater for Damien's ego. Now, it was a courtroom. I took my usual seat at the end of the table, but I did not open my laptop to take minutes. Instead, I placed a thick binder of documents in front of me. I folded my hands on top of it and waited. Victor Gonzalez stood at the head of the table. He looked 10 years older than he had at dinner the previous night. His eyes were bloodshot, and his suit, usually impeccable, looked slightly rumpled, as if he had slept in it. Damien sat to his right, staring fixedly at a knot in the wood of the table, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Gentlemen, Victor began, his voice rasping, we are facing a significant liquidity crisis. As you have likely heard, the funding for the Costa Aurelia expansion was withdrawn late last night. This has triggered a cascade of penalty clauses that we are currently negotiating. He paused, taking a sip of water. His hand shook slightly. However, Victor continued, his voice hardening, it is important that this board understands the nature of this withdrawal. This was not a market reaction. This was not a failure of strategy. This was a targeted attack from within. The entity that pulled the funding is controlled by my daughter, Taylor. A ripple of murmurs went through the room. Heads turned toward me. The expressions ranged from shock to confusion. Victor pointed a finger at me. She has used a technicality to hold this company hostage. She has put 4,000 jobs at risk to settle a personal grievance. This is sabotage, pure and simple. I sat perfectly still. I let his accusation hang in the air, letting the directors absorb the narrative he was trying to spin. He was painting me as the emotional, vindictive daughter. It was a good strategy, provided nobody looked at the paperwork. May I speak? I asked. My voice was calm, cutting through the murmur. Victor glared at me. You have done enough damage. I am not asking as your daughter. Victor, I said, keeping my eyes on the other directors. I am speaking as the managing partner of Falcon Ridge Capital, the largest single holder of Auristone debt and equity as of this morning. Unless you want me to call an immediate vote of no confidence based on the CEO's refusal to hear a major shareholder, I suggest you let me speak. The room went silent. The dynamics of power had shifted physically in the air. Raymond Clark, the longest-serving director, leaned forward. Let her speak. Victor, Raymond said gruffly, if she controls the money, we need to hear her reasons. Victor sat down heavily. I stood up. I did not shout. I did not pace. I opened my binder. The withdrawal of $85 million was not personal, I said, addressing the board. It was a fiduciary necessity. My fund, Falcon Ridge, operates under strict risk management protocols. We provided the capital for this expansion based on a specific set of operational milestones and risk assessments. Those milestones were ignored. Those risks were concealed. I picked up the first document. Lydia, I said, turning to our CFO. Lydia Moore. She looked terrified, but she met my gaze. When Damien presented the funding package to you last week, did he disclose the identity of the lead investor? Lydia cleared her throat. No, she whispered. He described it as a blind consortium of international institutional investors. Did he perform a Know Your Customer check on the source of the funds? I asked. Lydia looked down at her hands. No. He told us the vetting had been handled externally and that we needed to sign immediately to lock in the rate. He bypassed the standard compliance review. I nodded. Thank you. I turned back to the board. The chief operating officer of this company signed an $85 million agreement without knowing who he was borrowing from. He was so desperate to close the deal that he skipped the most basic level of due diligence. If I had been a cartel, or a sanctioned entity, or a competitor looking to strip assets, Damien would have opened the door just as wide. Damien's head snapped up. That is not fair, he shouted. You used shell companies. You hid it on purpose. I ignored him. I flipped to the next tab in my binder. Furthermore, I continued, the withdrawal was triggered because the project is fundamentally unsound. I pulled a document from the binder and slid it down the long table toward Raymond Clark. He put on his reading glasses and picked it up. This is a risk memo dated 3 weeks ago. I said, it was prepared by the analysts at Falcon Ridge. It outlines 3 critical issues: the instability of the currency peg in Costa Aurelia, the imminent labor strikes, and the lack of soil stability reports for the construction site. I looked at Damien. Damien, I said, did you read this memo? Damien scoffed, crossing his arms. I get hundreds of memos a week. Taylor, I cannot memorize every single line of text from some junior analyst. It was not from a junior analyst, I corrected him. It was attached to the term sheet you signed. It was a condition of the funding. One of the directors, a man named Henderson, frowned. Damien, answer the question. Did you read the risk assessment? I skimmed it. Damien lied. His voice was too high. It was standard boilerplate language. Every deal has risks. That is business. You cannot let lawyers paralysis you. I turned to the screen on the wall. If you could please look at the monitor, I said. I connected my laptop and projected an email chain. This is the correspondence between Damien and the legal team at Falcon Ridge. I said, please look at the date, October 14th. I pointed to a highlighted paragraph. The fund explicitly proposed a 6-month delay on the groundbreaking. I read aloud. We suggested waiting until the local elections in Costa Aurelia were concluded to ensure regulatory stability. We offered to hold the capital in escrow during this period. I turned to the board. A 6-month delay would have cost the company nothing. It would have secured the capital and mitigated the political risk. It was a safety net. I clicked to the next slide. This is Damien's reply, sent 20 minutes later. The text on the screen was short and brutal. Delay is unacceptable. We need the PR win for Q4. Remove the contingency clause or we walk. I looked at the directors. He rejected a safety net because he wanted a press release. I said. He gambled $85 million of capital because he wanted a headline before Christmas. The room was deadly quiet. The directors were reading the email, their faces hardening. They were businessmen. They understood ambition, but they did not forgive recklessness. But it gets worse, I said. I clicked to the final slide. It showed a comparison of two documents. On the left was the draft sent by my fund. On the right was the final version circulated to the Oristone board last week. Please look at section 4.2, I said. On the left, the text read, "Funding is contingent on continuous approval of local regulatory permits." On the right, in the version the board had seen, that line was missing. I turned to Damien. "You deleted it," I said. "You personally edited the document before sending it to the board for approval. You removed the clause that warned the directors that the money could be stopped if the permits were not ready." Damien stood up, his chair crashing backward. "I was streamlining it," he shouted, sweat beading on his forehead. "It was too technical. The board trusts me to handle the details. I did not want to bog them down with legal jargon." Marcus Thorne, the company's general counsel, who had been sitting silently in the corner, suddenly spoke up. His voice was dry and sharp like rustling paper. "That is not streamlining. Damien," Marcus said, "that is material misrepresentation." Every head in the room turned to the lawyer. "If you altered a financial document to hide a risk condition from the board of directors," Marcus continued, taking off his glasses, "that is fraud. If the shareholders found out, we would not just be facing penalties from the withdrawal. We would be facing a class action lawsuit and an SEC investigation." Damien went pale. He looked at our father. "Dad, tell them. I was just trying to get the deal done for us. I was showing initiative." Victor remained seated. He was staring at the email on the screen. He was looking at the proof that his son, the genius, the future CEO, had not only been incompetent but had actively lied to him. Victor did not speak. I closed my binder. The sound was a soft thud that echoed in the silence. "I did not pull the funding because I'm a jealous sister," I said, my voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "I pulled it because Falcon Ridge Capital does not invest in fraud, and I assume Oristone Logistics does not wish to be led by it." I looked at Raymond Clark. "Mr. Clark," I said, "as a major shareholder, I am formally requesting that the board reevaluate the position of the chief operating officer effective immediately." Raymond looked at me. For years, he had seen me as the girl who fetched the coffee. He had seen me as Victor's shadow. Now, he looked at me with a strange mixture of wariness and respect. He was seeing a predator who had just taken down prey twice her size. He nodded slowly. "I second the motion," Raymond said. Damien made a sound like a wounded animal. He looked around the table, searching for an ally, for a friendly face, but the directors were all looking down at their papers, or looking at the screen, or looking at me. "Sit down. Damien," Victor whispered. Damien froze. "Dad?" "Sit down!" Victor roared, slamming his fist on the table. Damien collapsed into his chair. He buried his face in his hands. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply sat back, folded my hands over the binder, and watched the room reorganize itself around the new center of gravity. The girl who could not handle real business had just fired the man who thought he owned it, and I had done it without raising my voice. The silence in the boardroom had shifted texture. It was no longer the stunned silence of surprise. It was the heavy, calculating silence of men and women reassessing their alliances. I could feel the weight of their gazes shifting from Damien, who was slumped in his chair like a deflated balloon, to me. Victor, however, was not ready to concede the floor. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white, his face flushing a deep, dangerous red. He looked at me not as his daughter, but as a hostile entity that had breached his perimeter. "You have no right to be here," Victor spat, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "You are an employee. You are a minute-taker. You have disrupted a board meeting with unauthorized documents and malicious accusations. I am exercising my right as chairman to remove you from this session. Security will escort you out." He reached for the phone on the console table. I did not move. I did not flinch. I simply watched his hand hover over the receiver. I would not do that if I were you. Dad, I said. My voice was low, conversational, as if I were suggesting he choose the fish over the steak. Victor froze. Are you threatening me? I am informing you. I corrected. You cannot remove me from this meeting because I am not just an employee, and I am not just the representative of the debt holder. I typed a command into my laptop. The screen on the wall refreshed. Gone were the emails proving Damien's fraud. In their place appeared a pie chart of Auristone Logistics Group's shareholder structure. There was a large blue slice representing Victor's holding, a sliver for the executive compensation pool, but there was also a significant solid gray wedge that had previously been listed under miscellaneous custodial accounts. I zoomed in on the gray wedge. Over the last 5 years, I said, addressing the room, I have been systematically acquiring voting shares of this company. Every time Damien missed a quarterly target and the stock dipped, I bought. Every time there was a panic sell-off because of a missed shipment, I bought. I looked at Damien. When you crashed the fleet efficiency rating in 2019, the stock fell 12%. I picked up 2 points of the company that week. Thank you for the discount. I turned back to Victor. Through Falcon Ridge Capital and its associated entities, I currently control 19.8% of Auristone's outstanding voting stock. The room gasped. It was a soft, collective intake of breath. 19.8%. It was just shy of the threshold that would trigger a mandatory public tender offer, but it was enough to make me the second largest individual shareholder after my father. I am not a guest, I said, leaning back in my chair. I am a principal. And under the corporate bylaws, Section 8, Paragraph 3, any shareholder with more than 15% ownership has an automatic right to a seat at this table during crisis proceedings. You cannot kick me out. Victor, I own too much of the furniture. Victor stared at the screen. He looked like he had been struck by a physical blow. He had spent his life believing he was the emperor, only to realize his daughter had been buying the bricks of his castle one by one. This is a hostile action, Victor stammered. It is a protective action, I countered. I bought the shares because I knew that one day, this family would need a safety net that Damien could not burn through. Today is that day. Victor looked around the table, his eyes darting frantically to the other directors. He needed an ally. He locked eyes with Raymond Clark, the 70-year-old director who had sat on this board since my grandfather's days. Raymond was the conscience of the company, a man who respected tradition above all else. Raymond, Victor pleaded, you cannot allow this. She is turning the boardroom into a circus. We need to adjourn. We need to sort this out as a family, in private. Raymond Clark slowly took off his reading glasses. He folded them and placed them in his breast pocket. He looked at Victor. Then he looked at me. There was a long, heavy pause. Raymond reached into his leather portfolio and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He slid it across the polished wood until it rested in front of me. I picked it up. It was a proxy form, signed and dated 5 minutes ago. Mr. Clark? Victor asked, his voice trembling. I have seen many things in this room. Victor, Raymond said, his voice gravelly and slow. I have seen booms and busts. I have seen your father build this company from the dirt. But I have never seen a clearer case of negligence than what your son has displayed today. Raymond gestured to me. Taylor has the numbers. She has the capital. And unlike Damien, she seems to have read the paperwork. As of this moment, my voting block is proxied to Taylor Gonzalez. I looked at the paper in my hand. Raymond held 7% of the company. Combined with my stake, I now controlled nearly 27% of the vote. With the support of the institutional investors who usually followed Raymond's lead, the balance of power had just tipped. The scale had crashed down on my side. Victor sank back into his chair. He looked small. He looked defeated. I did not give him time to recover. I turned my attention to Damien. Let us return to the agenda, I said. My tone was crisp, stripping away the family drama and leaving only the cold, hard mechanics of business. Damien, please stand up. Damien looked at our father, but Victor was staring at the table. Damien stood up slowly, his legs shaky. He looked like a schoolboy called to the principal's office, not a chief operating officer. You claimed earlier that the $15 million penalty was an unforeseen market circumstance, I said. Damien swallowed hard. It is. The market is volatile. Wrong, I said. I opened a spreadsheet on the screen. It was a variance analysis of the project's budget. I want you to explain line item 42. I said, this is the allocation for legal contingencies. Why is it 0? Damien squinted at the screen. I do not know. The finance team handles the line items. You are the project lead, I snapped. You signed the budget. Why did you allocate $0 for legal contingencies on a cross-border construction project in a high-risk jurisdiction? Damien stammered, We wanted to keep the overhead low, to make the margins look better for the board presentation. So you manipulated the projected margin by removing necessary safeguards? I asked. No, we were being optimistic. Optimism is not a strategy. Damien, I said, it is a liability. I turned to Lydia Moore. The CFO was sitting very still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had been silent for years, terrified of Victor's temper, but the wind was blowing in a different direction now, and Lydia was smart enough to know which way to lean. Lydia, I said gently, was it Damien's decision to zero out the contingency fund? Lydia looked up. Her eyes met mine. She saw the strength there, and she borrowed a little of it. Yes, she said. Her voice was quiet but clear. Did you advise him against it? I asked. Lydia nodded. Multiple times. I sent him 3 emails warning that it was reckless. I told him that without a contingency fund, any delay would eat directly into our operating cash flow. And what was his response? Lydia took a deep breath. She glanced at Victor, then back to me. He told me to stop being a bean counter, she said. He told me that if I did not make the numbers look attractive enough to get the board's approval, he would find a CFO who could... The room went deadly silent again. This was the final nail. Incompetence was one thing. Coercing a financial officer to manipulate data was another. It was a fireable offense. It was the kind of thing that got executives banned from serving on public boards. Damien, is this true? Raymond Clark asked, his voice like thunder. Damien's face crumbled. I was just trying to get it done. You all put so much pressure on me. Be like Victor, everyone says. Grow the company. I was just trying to give you the growth you wanted. He was whining. He was blaming everyone but himself. I looked at my father. Victor was watching Damien with a strange expression. It was a mixture of heartbreak and horror. He was seeing his son clearly for the first time, not the idealized version he had built in his head, but the weak, unethical reality standing before him. And then he looked at me. He saw the cold precision. He saw the way I commanded the room. He saw the 19.8%. He realized that while he was busy trying to mold Damien into a king, I had built an empire in the shadows. He was torn. Part of him hated me for destroying his dream, but another part of him, the ruthless businessman part that valued power above all else, was looking at me with a grudging, terrified respect. He had 2 children. One was a liability, the other was an asset, and Victor Gonzalez had never held on to a liability for long. I closed the spreadsheet. The evidence is conclusive, I said. We have a chief operating officer who commits fraud, ignores risk, manipulates financial data, and intimidates staff. We have a liquidity crisis triggered by his negligence, and we have a board that has been asleep at the wheel. I looked at Janet, the independent director sitting at the far end of the table. She was a stern woman with a background in corporate restructuring. She had been scribbling notes furiously for the last 10 minutes. Janet? I asked. Janet stopped writing. She capped her pen. She looked at Damien, then at Victor, and finally at me. Thank you, Ms. Gonzalez, Janet said. Her voice was professional, detached. The facts presented are disturbing. The governance failure here is profound. She turned to the rest of the board. Given the severity of the financial exposure and the clear evidence of misconduct, I do not believe we can adjourn without action. We have a fiduciary duty to the shareholders, including the new major shareholder who has just identified herself. Janet folded her hands on the table. I move that we hold an immediate vote of confidence regarding the continuation of Damian Gonzalez as Chief Operating Officer of Oristone Logistics Group. I second the motion, Raymond Clark said immediately. Damian made a sound that was half sob, half gasp. He looked at Victor. Dad, do something. You cannot let them vote. Victor did not move. He stared at the polished wood of the table, his face a mask of conflict. He was the chairman. He could try to stall. He could try to argue, but he knew the math, he knew the bylaws, and deep down, he knew the truth. The motion has been seconded, I said, my voice ringing out in the quiet room. I looked at my brother. Real business. Damian, I said softly, it is not about who your father is. It is about the count of the hands. I looked around the table. All those in favor of removing Damian Gonzalez from his position effective immediately. Please raise your hand. I raised my hand first. It was steady. It was high. And then, I waited to see who would follow. The 48 hours following the board meeting were not spent in silence. They were spent in a trench war fought with billable hours and press releases. Damian did not go home to reflect on his failures. He went straight to the offices of Sterling and Vance, a law firm known for aggressive litigation and exorbitant retainers. By Tuesday morning, the first shot had been fired across my bow. I was sitting in the temporary executive office I had commandeered on the 42nd floor, reviewing the liquidity reports, when the notification flashed across my tablet. It was an article from the Harbor Crest Business Journal, the same publication my mother had been cooing over just 2 days ago. The headline was bold and ugly. Sibling rivalry or corporate sabotage. The inside story of the Oristone crisis. I tapped the screen, my eyes scanning the text. It was a masterpiece of fiction. The article cited sources close to the Gonzalez family, who claimed that the withdrawal of the $85 million was a calculated act of malice by a disgruntled family member seeking to destabilize the company leadership. It painted Damian as a visionary martyr and me as the jealous sister, the unqualified assistant who had used a technicality to burn down the house because she wasn't allowed to play with the big kids. My intercom buzzed. It was Sarah, the head of internal communications. Her voice was tight with panic. Ms. Gonzalez, she said, I have 3 reporters on line 1, 2, and 4. They are asking about Falcon Ridge Capital. They want to know if the fund is a legitimate vehicle or a vengeful shell company, as one of them put it. Damian's lawyers are leaking the narrative that you manipulated the stock price for personal gain. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the city skyline. Damian was trying to fight a financial battle with a popularity contest. He thought that if he could control the story, he could ignore the math. It was a pathetic strategy, but it was dangerous. If the market believed the company was in the grip of a petty family feud, the stock would tank even harder. Tell the reporters to hold, I said calmly. But Ms. Gonzalez, Sarah stammered, if we do not comment, the narrative sets, we need to issue a denial. We are not going to deny anything. Sarah, I said, we are going to correct the record. I hung up and opened my encrypted drive. I found the file I needed, a document Damian had likely forgotten he ever signed. It was a side letter, a supplementary agreement attached to the Series A funding round. In the rush to close the deal, Damian had signed it without reading it, just like he had signed everything else. The side letter explicitly acknowledged that the lead investor reserved the right to withdraw funds if the operational risk profile exceeded the parameters set in the initial audit, but the kicker was paragraph 4. It stated, the executive management of Oristone Logistics acknowledges full awareness of these conditions and accepts personal liability for maintaining compliance. He had signed it. His signature was there in blue ink, looping and arrogant. I forwarded the document to Sarah. Send this to the reporters. I said, "Tell them this is an on-the-record document." And Sarah? Attach the email logs from October 14th, the ones where Damien explicitly orders the risk warnings to be deleted from the board packet. "Are you sure?" Sarah asked. This is nuclear." "I am sure," I said. "If my brother wants a media war, I will give him one. But I do not fight with rumors. I fight with receipts." I waited. The response was almost immediate. Within 2 hours, the headlines began to shift. The Financial Times picked up the story, but they did not run with Damien's soap opera angle. They ran with the data. Shadow investor revealed. The billion-dollar portfolio behind the Auristone crisis. The narrative flipped. Suddenly, I was not the jealous sister. I was the savvy operator. The press began digging into Falcon Ridge Capital. They found the returns. They found the assets. They found the $920 million. The story transformed from a family drama into a revelation of a hidden tycoon. Damien was no longer the victim. He was the incompetent executive who had tried to hustle a whale and got eaten. By Wednesday afternoon, the atmosphere in the executive suite was suffocating. I received a summons to my father's office. It was not a request. When I walked in, the room felt like a funeral parlor. The curtains were drawn, casting long shadows across the Persian rugs. Victor was sitting behind his massive oak desk, looking diminished. Damien was pacing back and forth in front of the window, his tie loosened, his eyes wild and bloodshot. He stopped pacing when I entered. He looked at me with a hatred so pure it was almost impressive. "You leaked the emails," Damien spat. "You humiliated me. Do you know what they are calling me on Twitter? Do you know what the analysts are saying?" "They are saying you committed fraud," I said, taking a seat without being offered one, which, legally speaking, is accurate. "Enough!" Victor slammed his hand on the desk. He looked at me. His face was gray. "Taylor, this has to stop," Victor said. "The stock is down 8% this morning. The shareholders are panicking. We are becoming a laughingstock." "Then tell your son to stop briefing the press with lies," I said. Damien lunged toward the desk. "She is the one destroying us. Dad, you have to do something. You have to stop her. She thinks she is untouchable because she has a little money." "A little money," I repeated, amused. "Damien, I could buy you and sell you for parts before lunch." Victor held up a hand. "I have spoken to the estate lawyers," Victor said, his voice heavy. I raised an eyebrow. "Oh? You are playing a dangerous game." "Taylor," Victor continued, "you have 19% of the company. Yes, but the rest of the family controls the trust, the estate, the inheritance." He leaned forward, trying to summon the authority he had wielded over me since I was a child. "If you do not reverse this withdrawal, and if you do not issue a statement clearing Damien's name, I will remove you from the will." Damien nodded vigorously, a cruel smile touching his lips. "That is right. The beach house, the trust fund, the liquidity from the estate, all of it. You will be cut off. You will get nothing." Victor locked eyes with me. "It is a lot of money. Taylor, generational wealth. Do not throw it away for pride." I stared at them. I looked at the father who thought money was the only leash he had. I looked at the brother who thought inheritance was a career plan. They really did not understand. They were still playing Monopoly, and I was playing real estate. I let out a soft laugh. "The will?" I asked. "Yes," Victor said, sensing victory. "The will." "Dad," I said, leaning forward, "I made $42 million last quarter from a single short position on the copper market." Victor blinked. "The trust fund pays out what? $200,000 a year?" I asked. "I make that before I finish my morning coffee." I stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the city. "You are threatening to cut off my allowance," I said, turning back to them. "But you are forgetting who is actually funding this family. Who do you think bought the bond issuance that kept Auristone solvent in 2020? Who do you think quietly acquired the debt on the warehouse expansion when the banks wanted to foreclose?" I looked at Damien. Who do you think paid off the settlement for that harassment suit you thought disappeared 3 years ago? Damien's face went white. You know about that? I paid it, I said, through a blind trust, because I did not want the company's stock to tank. I walked back to the desk and placed my hands flat on the polished wood. I do not need your inheritance. Victor, I do not need your money, and I certainly do not need your permission. I looked from one man to the other. Auristone needs me. It needs my capital to pay the penalty fees Damien incurred. It needs my reputation to calm the institutional investors. It needs my competence to clean up this mess. I straightened up, towering over the desk. But I said, my voice quiet and final. I do not need Auristone. I could liquidate my position tomorrow, take the tax write-off, and never think about this company again. And if I do that, the stock goes to zero, and this legacy you care so much about becomes a footnote in a bankruptcy filing. Damien let out a strangled scream. He grabbed a heavy crystal paperweight from the desk and hurled it across the room. It smashed into the wall, shattering into 1,000 glittering shards. "You are a monster!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "You stole my life! You stole my company!" I did not flinch at the shattering glass. I just watched him unravel. I did not steal anything. Damien, I said, I just stopped subsiding your delusion. I turned to Victor. You have 24 hours to decide. You can have a son who pretends to be a CEO, or you can have a company that actually functions, but you cannot have both, and you definitely cannot threaten me with poverty. Those days are over. I turned and walked to the door. Damien was hyperventilating, gripping the back of a chair. Victor was slumped in his seat, looking at the shattered crystal on the floor, a perfect metaphor for the reality he was finally forced to accept. I opened the door. Real business. Gentlemen, I said, it is brutally expensive. I walked out, leaving them in the ruins of their own making. Thursday morning brought with it the stench of desperation. It hung in the boardroom air, heavier than the scent of stale coffee and fear. The penalty deadline from the Costa Aurelia banks was less than 48 hours away. The stock had bled another 6% at the opening bell. The vultures were circling. Credit rating agencies were threatening a downgrade, and 2 of our major lenders had called to discuss collateral reevaluation, which is banker code for preparing to seize assets. We were facing a soft bankruptcy. It would not be a dramatic explosion, but a slow suffocation where vendors stopped shipping and lines of credit dried up. I sat at the table, my laptop closed. I did not need slides today. I needed leverage, and I had all of it. Victor sat at the head of the table, looking like a man who had aged a decade in 3 days. Damien was there, too, slumped in his chair, his eyes dark and hollow. He looked like a ghost haunting his own funeral. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable. Finally, Raymond Clark cleared his throat. "We are listening. Taylor," he said, "you mentioned a proposal." I nodded. I slid a single crisp document across the table to the center. "The situation is binary," I began, my voice devoid of emotion. "We have a liquidity gap of $25 million needed to cover the penalties and stabilize operations for the next quarter. The current lending market is closed to us because of the reputational damage caused by the executive mismanagement we discussed on Monday." I paused, letting the reality sink in. "Auristone cannot borrow its way out of this," I said. "You need equity. You need cash." "I am offering a rescue package via Falcon Ridge Capital," I continued. "I have assembled a new consortium. We are prepared to inject $40 million immediately to settle the penalties and shore up the balance sheet." Victor's eyes lit up slightly, a flicker of hope. "Thank you. Taylor," he breathed. "I knew you would not let the family fall. We can restructure the Costa Aurelia deal and—" I cut him off. "The Costa Aurelia project is dead." "Victor," I said sharply, "we are not restructuring it. We are liquidating it. We are selling the land rights and writing off the loss. My capital is not going toward vanity projects in the jungle. It is going toward modernizing our domestic fleet and upgrading the warehouse automation systems. The very systems I proposed 10 years ago. Damien sat up. You cannot cancel Costa Aurelia. That is my legacy. We have already broken ground. I ignored him. I looked at the board members. The capital comes with conditions, I said. These are non-negotiable. Janet, the independent director, leaned forward. Name them. Condition 1, I said, holding up a finger. Damien Gonzalez is removed from all strategic and operational roles effective immediately. He will not hold the title of COO. He will not hold a seat on the board. He will not have signing authority on any company account. Damien slammed his hand on the table. You cannot do that. I own shares. I am the heir. You are a liability, I said, not looking at him. If you want to keep your shares, you can sit at home and collect dividends, assuming we make a profit, but you will not step foot in this building as an executive again. Victor looked pained. Taylor, that is too harsh. He made a mistake. We can suspend him. We can put him on a development plan. He is your brother. I looked at my father. This is not a family therapy session. Victor, this is a term sheet. If Damien touches the steering wheel, I do not put gas in the car. It is that simple. I raised a second finger. Condition 2. The creation of a risk management and governance committee. I will serve as the chair of this committee. No capital expenditure over $50,000 gets approved without my signature. No expansion projects, no new debt. I control the checkbook until the stock price recovers to its pre-crisis levels. Raymond Clark nodded slowly. That is prudent, he murmured, given the recent lapses. Condition 3, I continued. We restructure the board. I looked around the room, making eye contact with 2 directors who were old golf buddies of my father, men who had rubber-stamped every bad decision Damien had ever made. We reduced the board size from 12 to 7. I said, we remove the non-independent members who lack industry expertise. We bring in specialists in logistics AI and supply chain efficiency. This board ceases to be a social club and starts being a governing body. One of the golf buddies, a man named Miller, bristled. Are you suggesting we have not been doing our jobs? I am suggesting that you let an $85 million fraud happen under your noses because you were too busy agreeing with the chairman, I replied coldly. So, yes, that is exactly what I'm suggesting. And finally, condition 4, I said. I looked directly at Damien, then at Victor. The succession plan is abolished. The clause in the corporate charter that designates the CEO position as a hereditary appointment for the Gonzalez bloodline is struck down. The next CEO will be chosen by the board based on competence, performance, and metric-driven results. It might be me. It might be an external hire. But it will never be someone appointed by birthright. The room was silent. This was the death knell of the monarchy. I was dismantling the very idea that this company was a kingdom to be inherited. Victor's face turned purple. You are stripping me of my authority, he said, his voice shaking. You are taking my company and handing it over to strangers. I am saving your company from your son. I corrected him. I opened a folder and handed out a set of projections. Look at the last page, I said. The directors flipped the pages. This is the forecast under my restructuring plan, I explained. By cutting the Costa Aurelia losses, automating the Harborcrest facility, and trimming the executive bloat, we increase EBITDA by 18% in the first year. We restore the dividend within 18 months. The stock price rebounds and likely surpasses its all-time high within 2 years. I pointed to the chart. This is profit, gentlemen, real, sustainable profit, not projected fantasy numbers based on a jungle casino. Janet studied the numbers. She looked up, and for the first time, she smiled. These margins are conservative, she noted. You have factored in a heavy contingency for the transition. I always factor in the downside. Janet, I said, that is why I still have my money. Victor tried one last time. He looked desperate, a king watching his crown melt. We can negotiate this, he said. Damien can step down to vice president. We keep the succession clause but add a competency test. We do not need to rewrite the charter. Taylor, be reasonable. I gathered my papers and started to stand up. I am being reasonable, I said. I am offering to buy a burning building. If you do not like the price, you are welcome to let it burn. I looked at my watch. I have a meeting with my fund partners at noon. You have until then to accept the term sheet in its entirety. If you change a single comma, the deal is off. I walk away. The bank calls the loan tomorrow. And by Monday, you are filing for Chapter 11 protection. Damien stood up. He was shaking, his face wet with tears and sweat. You witch, he screamed. He sounded like a child who had been told Santa Claus was dead. You planned this. You want to steal it all. It is mine. It is my birthright. I am the son. I am the Gonzalez heir. He pointed at the directors, flailing his arms. Do not listen to her. She is just an assistant. She fetched coffee for 3 years. She does not know how to lead men. She is bluffing. I stood perfectly still. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. His tantrum was doing all the work for me. Every time he screamed, every time he stomped his foot, he was proving my point. He was showing the board exactly what leadership looked like under the current regime. He was showing them an $85 million toddler. Raymond Clark looked at Damien with profound embarrassment. He looked at Victor, who had buried his head in his hands, unable to watch his son disintegrate. Then Raymond looked at me. He saw the calm. He saw the cold, hard competence. Victor, Raymond said, his voice cutting through Damien's shouting, I think the board needs to deliberate. But Victor started. Without the family? Raymond added firmly. Janet nodded. I agree. We need an executive session. Please, Mr. Chairman, ask your son to sit down or leave the room. Damien gasped, looking betrayed. Raymond? You are siding with her? I am siding with the 18% profit margin. Damien, Raymond said dryly. Janet looked at me. Ms. Gonzalez, she said, using my professional title with a new weight. The board requests a recess of 1 hour to discuss your terms. Please wait in the breakout room. I nodded. Take your time, I said. I turned and walked toward the door. Behind me, Damien was still muttering, but the energy had gone out of him. He was a balloon that had finally run out of air. As I reached the door, I paused and looked back at my father. He was looking at me. His eyes were wide, filled with a strange mix of devastation and awe. He had spent 30 years looking for a successor, looking for someone strong enough to hold the weight of his legacy. He had looked right past me every single day, and now he was realizing that the strength he worshipped had been there all along. He just had to break the company to find it. 1 hour, I said. I walked out into the hallway and let the door click shut. The silence of the corridor wrapped around me. I checked my watch. 59 minutes until I owned it all. The hour of deliberation felt longer than the 30 years I had spent waiting for my father to notice me. I sat in the breakout room, a small glass-walled fishbowl that smelled of anxiety and stale pastries. I did not check my phone. I did not pace. I watched the second hand on the wall clock sweep past the 12, again and again, marking the dismantling of the old regime. At exactly 1 o'clock, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom opened. Marcus Thorne, the general counsel, stepped out. His face was unreadable, a mask of professional neutrality. Ms. Gonzalez, he said, the board is ready for you. I stood up. My legs felt heavy, but I forced them to move with a fluid, predatory grace. I smoothed the lapel of my blazer. I walked past Marcus, ignoring the sympathetic nod he gave me. I did not want sympathy. I wanted control. I entered the room. The atmosphere had transformed. It was no longer a battlefield. It was a crash site. The debris had been cleared, but the scars remained. The directors were seated, their postures rigid. Victor was still at the head of the table, but he looked smaller, as if the air had been let out of him. He was staring at his hands, which were clasped tightly in front of him on the polished wood. Damien was sitting to his right. His tie was askew. His face was blotchy and red. the remnants of a tantrum that had clearly exhausted him. He looked up when I entered, his eyes filled with a wet, venomous hate. I walked to the empty chair at the opposite end of the table, my seat, but I did not sit down. I stood behind it, placing my hands on the leather backrest, waiting. Janet, the independent director who had led the revolt, stood up. She held a single sheet of paper. "Ms. Gonzalez," Janet began, her voice crisp and formal. "The board has concluded its executive session. We have voted on the terms of your restructuring proposal." I waited. The silence in the room was so profound I could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents. "First," Janet said, "regarding the position of Chief Operating Officer, the board has voted unanimously to pass Resolution 7B, effective immediately. Damian Gonzalez is relieved of all operational duties. His employment contract is terminated for cause, citing gross negligence, material misrepresentation of financial data, and breach of fiduciary duty." Damian let out a strangled noise, like a dog being kicked. He started to stand up, but Victor put a hand on his arm. It was a weak gesture, but it held him down. "Second," Janet continued, ignoring him, "regarding the capital injection and governance, the board has voted to accept the term sheet provided by Falcon Ridge Capital in its entirety. This includes the immediate formation of a risk management committee and the restructuring of the board seats to prioritize industry expertise over non-executive affiliation." She paused, looking over her reading glasses at me. "And third," Janet said, "regarding the leadership transition, the board has voted to appoint Taylor Gonzalez as the interim executive chair of Oristone Logistics Group, with full executive authority to oversee the restructuring process until a permanent CEO is named. This appointment is effective immediately." The words hung in the air. Executive chair. It was a title that placed me above the CEO. It placed me above my father. I looked at Victor. He did not look up. He was staring at the table as if trying to memorize the grain of the wood. Damian, however, could not contain himself. He exploded. "No!" he screamed, shoving his chair back so hard it tipped over with a deafening crash. He scrambled to his feet, pointing a shaking finger at the directors. "You cannot do this. This is a coup. She bought you. She bribed you with her hedge fund money." He turned to me, his face twisted into an ugly mask of rage. "You snake! You think you can just walk in here and buy my company? You bribed them, didn't you? How much did you pay Janet? How much did you promise Raymond?" I did not flinch. I did not blink. I watched him scream with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. Damian turned to our father, grabbing Victor's shoulder and shaking him. "Dad, tell them it is illegal. They cannot fire me. I am your son. This is our company." Victor looked up. His eyes were watery, red-rimmed and exhausted. He looked at Damian, really looked at him, and saw the hysteria, the entitlement, the complete lack of dignity. He saw the child he had coddled into incompetence. Then he looked at me. It was a look I will carry to my grave. It was complex, layered with 30 years of history. There was fear there, certainly. He was afraid of the stranger who wore his daughter's face. There was regret, deep and bitter, for the years he had wasted betting on the wrong horse. But underneath the fear and the regret, there was something else, something that looked terrifyingly like pride. He saw the strength. He saw the cold, hard steel that he had always claimed to value, but had never recognized until it was pressed against his throat. "Sit down, Damian," Victor whispered. "No!" Damian yelled. "I will not sit down. I am going to sue all of you. I am going to—" "Mr. Gonzalez?" Marcus Thorne's voice cut through the shouting like a whip. The general counsel stepped forward. He held up a recording device. "I would advise you to stop speaking," Marcus said calmly. "Everything you are saying is being recorded in the official minutes of this meeting. Accusations of bribery against the board are slanderous and could expose you to further liability. Your termination is for cause. If you continue this outburst, security will be called to escort you from the building." Damian froze. He looked at the lawyer, He looked at the board members, who were all averting their eyes in embarrassment. He looked at his father, who had turned his back on him. And finally, he looked at me. He was waiting for me to gloat. He was waiting for me to smile, to laugh, to rub his nose in the dirt. He wanted me to be emotional so he could dismiss me as Crazy Taylor. But I gave him nothing. I gave him only the blank, professional stare of a stranger. "I am not doing this to you. Damien," I said softly, "the numbers are doing this to you." Damien's mouth opened and closed. He realized, finally, that he had lost. He had not just lost the job, he had lost the audience. He grabbed his jacket from the back of his fallen chair. He did not pick the chair up. He stormed toward the door, his footsteps heavy and uneven. When he reached the exit, he turned back one last time. "You will bankrupt this place in a month," he shouted. "You do not know what real business is." The door slammed shut behind him. The sound echoed in the room, final and absolute. Silence returned to the boardroom. The air felt lighter, cleaner, as if a toxic gas had been vented out. Janet looked at me. "Ms. Gonzalez," she said respectfully, "the chair is yours." I walked around the long mahogany table. I walked past the directors, who nodded at me as I passed. I walked past my father. He did not look at me, but he shifted his chair slightly to make room. It was a small gesture, a surrender. I reached the head of the table. I stood there for a moment, looking out at the room. I looked at the screen where the projection of my restructuring plan was still glowing. I looked at the faces of the people who had ignored me for a decade. I sat down. The leather of the chairman's seat was cool and firm. It felt right. It felt like I had finally arrived at the destination I had been walking toward since I was 13 years old. Sitting in my grandmother's kitchen learning to read a balance sheet. I placed my hands on the table. "Thank you. Janet," I said. My voice was steady, resonant. I looked at the board. "We have a lot of work to do. We have $25 million to wire to the banks before close of business. We have a press release to draft regarding the leadership change. And we have a warehouse in Harborcrest that needs a complete audit." I turned to my father. "Victor," I said. He looked up. He looked old, tired, but he was listening. "I will need your signature on the transfer documents for the shares," I said. He nodded slowly. "Yes, of course." I opened my laptop. I typed a single command, initiating the transfer of funds from Falcon Ridge Capital to Auristone Logistics. The rescue package was live. The company was safe. As the progress bar on my screen loaded, I allowed myself a single moment of internal reflection. My brother had stood in this room 5 days ago and told me I could not handle real business. He thought real business was shouting. He thought it was spending money you did not have to impress people you did not like. He thought it was about ego and bluster and being the loudest voice in the room. He was wrong. I watched the notification pop up on my screen. Transfer complete. Real business is not about who speaks the loudest. Real business is about who has the discipline to walk away from a bad deal, even when that deal is your own flesh and blood. Real business is knowing that respect is not inherited. It is purchased with competence and secured with leverage. I looked at the empty chair where Damien had sat. I handled it. "Let us begin," I said to the board. And for the first time in the history of Auristone Logistics, everyone started writing. Thank you so much for listening to this story of betrayal and redemption. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. Are you listening from a busy subway in New York, a quiet cafe in London, or maybe somewhere peaceful in Vietnam? Please leave a comment below sharing your location and your thoughts on Taylor's decision. If you enjoyed watching justice be served, please make sure to subscribe to the channel Lila Revenge Stories, hit the like button, and smash that hype button so this story can reach even more people who need a little reminder that competence always wins in the end.